Kilian Jörg is an artist and philosopher. His current research focuses on the car as a metaphor for the toxic behaviors of modernity, the psychological effects of living in a time of ecocide, and what sorts of activist strategies for reclaiming land might be effective at shaking off the psychology of resignation. My conversation with Kilian was one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done on writing and thinking. I'm not sure where it came from, but the more tactile and situated sort of theorizing he's able to do makes me want to spend more time with the texts that he looks at. Because he's using them to weave together different concepts of liberation, with the ultimate goal, I think, of showing how we can fight this imposition of one worldview on the planet, Kilian is fighting to defend other possible methods of reasoning. It might not be a magical solution for our ecological crisis, but I found that talking to Kilian about the ideas in ecological reasonings opened up approaches to problems like what to do about Donald Trump, or artificial intelligence, or our attachment to the car as a convenience that we feel we can't live without, regardless of what it does to us. One of the wonderful things about his book is that it's using this idea of the resilience of reason to deconstruct and decompose the current technocratic world order. He's saying that there is a continuum between Trump, the narrowing of our political possibilities, our faith in technology, and mono-rationalism. What he wants is a world where we are actively nourishing ground for many other voices to be heard, where we're consciously worrying about and destabilizing the relationship between the things we consider active, aggressive, and ambitious, and the things that we consider and often dismiss as passive, wasteful, and directionless. Mono-rationalism, for those that maybe don't have time to sit down with the book, is committed, you say, to, quote, suppressing a possible plurality of reasonings. A multitude of different approaches to making meaning or finding reasons that exist on the planet are also not exclusively human. You say that these should no longer be understood in an anthro and androcentric limitation. So not just human and not just male. But then you actually frame the kind of emancipatory imperative of the book in terms of nourishing ground for many other voices to be heard. And I guess I wanted to start here because, we're talking about not just the argument of the book, but also some of the things that it's like yearning toward. Could you talk about how we can nourish the ground for other voices and leave space for even like non-human reasonings that we might not even recognize as having voices per se?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a tough introductory question, but thank you so much also for the praise of the book. Since one of the main arguments I built my book on is undoing the big modern dualisms of nature, culture, body, mind, and so on, I think it really comes down to the question of also choosing your environment wisely, because certain reasonings can only emerge out of a certain environment. And so this book is fairly recently published, but I've written it, I finished writing it 3 years ago. So I've had the time to write a whole other book afterwards, which is on the car, which I see kind of as a prosthesis, which is kind of enacting the embodiment of this monorationalist regime into the world. And so my argument, to put it a bit oversimplified, is that wherever you find modern machines like the car, other forms of reasoning become incredibly hard to follow through in a non-romantic relationship. So I write a lot about smell and how smelling could be a completely different kind of source for reasoning. But because most so-called animal species orient their reasoning after smelling and not after seeing. In philosophy, this is called oculocentrism. So we follow more visual inputs and smell we basically repress. Modern philosophy is based on repressing smell as something which is understood as letting out the base, uncontrollable drives in a way. So from Kant on, civilizational reasoning is about repressing smell. And I think like in machines like the car, you can see that it's kind of impossible to follow your smell through a city because you kind of have to repress it to stay sane. So this is a
Hmm.
long excursion to say that I think to make it plausible that other reasonings are not just holiday vacation modes where you can go and kind of pay a lot of money to go to a national park or where you can follow this, but where they can really influence your relevant cultured life and your everyday sense of it. I think it boils down to the question of how can we also fight for different zones and different environments where other forms of reasonings become more plausible. My book sets off from very pretty heady stuff, as your title is, like very epistemological, philosophical stuff. But in undoing nature, culture, and body mind, I think it really comes down also as a tool to think about how do we create new alliances and new entanglements with the world in order to make it plausible. Like it can't just be an argument; it really has to be a material practice which follows from it.
Yeah, I love that. Alliances and entanglements. And yeah, I mean, mono-rationalism affects and infects the things that you list in the book, like city planning, policy in general, certainly the law, the way the law is applied. When you write that quote, following another reason is kind of criminalized, pathologized, I think you're talking about particular cases of transgression, we could say, that you maybe have experimented with a little bit in your artistic practice. And I wonder if you wanted to talk about that a bit. I mean, in your experience, how does the actual design of our heavily modified habitats, as you put it, itself prevent and police experiments with different reasonings? And yeah, how have you maybe used art and collaboration, I don't know, to attempt to kind of fracture that policing, so to speak?
Mhm. So just as a disclaimer, so my critique of modern rationalism is heavily influenced by post-colonial and ecofeminist critique. So I really think it's also about the question of what do I embody? And though I use they them pronouns, I'm being read as a white man in the street. So I already have a quite good plausibility of being understood as a rational man in the street, even if I do crazy performance stuff. And I'm
Mm,
quite aware of this. Like if I was a black woman doing the performances I'm going to speak about now in the street, I would maybe have an even harder chance of establishing different kind of reasoning. So one
mm,
performance project I'm doing with two colleagues of mine, David Kumm and Hus Diepemat, is really to try to just be very open and perceptive in the public space. Perceptive is actually quite a good keyword because, as a Germanophone, uh, reason in German means Vernunft, and Vernunft comes from vernehmen, which is perceiving. So there's already this quality of reasoning in it that it has something to do with perceiving, which is quite different from,
mhm,
let's say, the Latin Anglophone tradition of seeing the ground of things. And so we're going to the streets and
mhm,
really try to perceive what is there and what kind of follows out of an impulse. And often when you're on a busy street, you want to scream, you want to shout against the cars, you want to have some aggression, like all this stuff, or you just want to, cry somewhere in a corner or something. And so we kind of try to follow this
mhm,
and just try to build a rational response to this in a way. Um, and when we started this research, and so this is funded, which also comes back to my embodiment as a white man, so I can get cultural funding from this sometimes doing it. And in the beginning, when we tried to do this, we just did like, a little intervention here, then we moved on, did a little intervention here. And so immediately you were being read as either, so all the calls we heard, like what people called us in the street were we either were homosexuals, we were crazy or drug addicts. Our skin color is white, so we were not foreigners. So it was always this. And so we kind of realized as soon as it's just a singular thing, it doesn't change anything, whatever we do in the street. It's just like people look and they're like, okay, it's some lunatics and move on. And so what we then established, and this is now an artistic format, is that we really create a loop on one block of a city and do that loop for a
mhm,
week and just modify this loop slowly. But so we kind of repeat our quote unquote insanity for a week. And this really was a big learning effect of how then people really get uneasy and are like, okay, something off is happening, but it's not just happening singularly in one event, but it's happening all the time. And so on this block we once did it, there was a restaurant. And on the third day, the restaurant owner told us that people reserved seats outside just to see us doing our weird shit in a way. And so I really feel like with this really taught us of how change works through iteration. This is like a Derridarian term, which was heavily used by Judith Butler in formulating her queer theory, that normality is only established through iteration. And so also what we now conventionally see as reasonability has been repeated, to oversimplify it, since Plato. And so it's really also about repeating what might seem as insane, as manic, but trying to systematize it, of trying to see what is in there. And maybe even like pushing a bit beyond the feelings of what am I doing here? Isn't it insane? And so on, to just like feel what different kind of sensitivities arise out of it. And another project I'm doing with a larger collective of mine is inventing a religion. So this is called the Toxic
I
Temple.
love this.
Yeah. And so there the idea is, how do I put this simply? So the religion Toxic Temple venerates those which will outlast us, which in our case is plastic and nuclear waste, because they will in all likelihood be for longer on this planet than we as humans in a way. So we see them as some kind of communication with the beyond, with the afterhuman, in some kind of weird way of immanent transcendence. So we see them as some sort of prayer communication to the afterlife. And we create rituals around them. We did it on kind of major art festivals already in Europe, where we got even churches which were disused and like just installed a Toxic Temple in there. And there again, it was the repetition which happened. Like if it's just a performance happening once, nobody really cares. It's a crazy art show and people go home and don't care. But if you offer religious services in this kind of weird, twisted way for 2 weeks, people come back and talk to you and they think about it and then they come back and so on. And that was really interesting. And for us, so this is like kind of how we are perceived from the exterior, but it's also always, I think it's important that artistic project also are some kind of research for yourself. Like, what does it do to you if you kind of systematically embrace insanity in like seeing plastic waste as a god? and what it does to you was really interesting, and trying to really sense after what kind of different reasoning, what kind of different relation to our environment and catastrophe could emerge out of this. And this was really interesting, in seeing a relationship to our destructiveness, which is not just a taboo. You know, we buy a plastic can in the supermarket, get the food out and then throw it away and feel a bit bad about it. But what if we kind of try to see, maybe there's a lust, maybe there's a desire in it, you know, there's the Thanatos drive in us, which kind of enjoys fucking up the planet in a way. And what if we give some room, some like ritual room for this, in order to enact this destructive desire in a more civilized way, so that it's not kind of the opposite of reason, but we can include it into a reasoning which might be more sustainable in the long run. These are 2 examples from my artistic practice.
And wow, really remarkable examples that are, as you say, about creating, nourishing the ground, creating room for a more lasting kind of experimentation with new relationships to the quote unquote Anthropocene, or this kind of interminable toxicity that we seem to be attached to. I really liked it. To me, this is related to the material in the text about how reason is reinscribed in the university as well as a really exclusionary, unitary thing. And the university in 2025 is also pretty good at absorbing certain subversive experiments as maybe one-offs that don't have ripple effects, like the ways in which writing about climate change has become kind of an endless book project, and the ways in which it's kind of also been standardized with certain turns of phrase, like seeing the world otherwise, these pat phrases that kind of lose their efficacy, I think, at a certain point. You know, it seems to me related to what you're talking about in the book in terms of how we are trained to write. So you say they make you speak in tongues that can be hurtful to the learner. You say that there's little active freedom of creation in the university. And you say that to resist this, things like allowing more movement can unsettle the kind of stereotype of the sedentary scholar. Just politicizing rigor can open up things. I was just kind of maybe hoping you could speak to what opening things up in these ways within the very rigid university can do for students, and how it could actually maybe even rescue the university, because it feels to me like the university is in crisis.
It definitely is. Although I think I have to disclaim that I think the European university situation or the university crisis is a bit of a different one than the North American one.
Sure.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so my very narrow institutional footing, which is like teaching as an external lecturer, is at art universities. I never got a foot into philosophy, although my book is very strongly philosophical, but I'm always perceived as kind of too crazy to be taken serious as a
Mm,
philosopher who publishes peer-reviewed papers and so on. Um,
mm,
so in art universities, I feel there is a certain freedom in trying things out. Like, what happens if we read a book, but everybody takes the corporal position they feel like? So half of the class lies on the ground, two others walk in circles, whatever. Like, what happens? Like,
mm,
like during the COVID time, I actually always encouraged people to turn off their cameras because I kind of felt this kind of camera presence of the kind of surveillance entity in your room kind of really, at least it paralyzed me, and I had the feeling it paralyzed others.
mm,
And so I told them,
mm,
let's use this freedom and turn off your camera and I don't know, go jogging, cook, whatever while the lecture. And I had the experience that I think the engagement of students was much more interesting and creative when they could just act out whatever their body was calling for in a way. Yeah, I feel the institutional weight of university is so heavy that people don't dare. So when you say this, it's always the kind of two most crazy, also often most privileged people, which feel very, very secure in that setting, and they get up
mm.
and go crazy. But the people who are like maybe from a working class background or so, they sit tightly because they're really happy they're in the university. Um, so right now, I'm more trying to like encourage students to doodle while I teach. And then we sometimes use this doodling as a kind of externalization of their unconscious. And I sometimes find this really helpful in not just like talking about what we consciously have there while discussing a certain topic, but also see what does our so-called unconscious tell us in a way. What is the kind of more passive elements of our thinking wanting us to be there in a way. Um, and then the last thing, and I mean, institutional critique could be a book or many books in itself, but one thing I find really annoying about academic philosophy and most other academic disciplines is so-called peer-reviewed journal articles, which are by now basically
Same.
the
My
yeah
goodness.
yeah it's basically the
Yeah.
only capital you have. Like, I mean, at least here in Europe, if you write a book, nobody really gives a shit about it. I mean, people read it, but it doesn't mean anything in your CV in terms of kind of academic capital.
Right.
So it's just peer-reviewed journal articles. And this particular style of have an abstract, you have an introduction, then you give argument A, B, C, and you give your arguments, and then you come to conclusion and so on. And this is a very narrow, limited form of thinking, which is maybe uh, it makes sense in working on the paradigm, uh, to say it in terms of Thomas S. Kuhn, in, I would say, applied sciences. So I think in
Right.
mathematics or in physics, it makes sense. Like, if the paradigm is all set, that you want to work out something in this paradigm, that's a good format. But for more working around the paradigm kind of sciences, like, and I would claim philosophy is absolutely this, it makes no sense. And I always tell my students, read all the classics you have to read, from Plato to Descartes to Wittgenstein in philosophy. Nobody would ever be accepted by a peer-reviewed journal. And what does this tell us about our discipline in a way? Like, imagine
Mhm.
writing a dialogue and Platonistic style where there is an operatic ending,
Hmm.
forget it. And I
No
think this
thanks.
is,
Yeah, there's no
yeah,
way.
I think this is very
Hmm.
telling. And I think this really also
Hmm.
produces a certain knowledge which is very limited and unhelpful. So I myself talk a lot about Platonism as kind of the arch enemy of ecological thinking. But then again, Platonism is just this condensed ism out of a very rich oeuvre which cannot be simplified that much. Like if you look at Plato, like
Hmm.
I do a close reading of the Phaedrus dialogue in my book,
Hmm.
where I really
Hmm.
try to work out, okay, we have Platonism. Platonism is basically, yeah, you have ideas, they're behind the sensual world. The sensual world is, unreliable. So you want to kind of get behind the sensual world to like see the real eternal ideas, and reason can only work on them. That's Platonism. We all learned this in kind of first semester philosophy classes. Um, but then when you read the Phaedrus, yes, Plato is kind of giving these arguments, but he's also seduced by a boy kind of 40 years younger than him, and he's being seduced to leave the city, and he doesn't like to leave the city at all. And so he's at this river, and basically is just trying to get into the pants of this young boy, which doesn't really succeed. And then he kind of dreams up a kind of very different reasoning where he's talking about the muses speak through him. So he's really talking about the muses of the play speaking through him. And it's really becoming a very lyric, poetic kind of reasoning. And then all of a sudden he stops and says, "Oh, what am I saying? This is not, solid, nice reasoning. I have to go back to the city. You seduced me to a thinking which is kind of dangerous." And
Hmm.
so Plato is wanting to cling to a certain kind of Platonist reasoning. And he's kind of realizing in this dialogue, oh, I have to go back to the kind of protected wall of the city where there's not enough so called nature, the muses of the place, which seduce me
Hmm.
to think with the planet. Because Platonism is kind
Yeah.
of really requiring you to like set yourself off the planet. And that you have this
Right.
in a Platonist dialogue, I think tells you or shows you so clearly that Plato had much more in mind than simple Platonism. And I think,
Right.
academic
And
knowledge
and that he
production,
had to repress it in a sense, right?
exactly.
That there was a repression. Yeah.
But he was an amazingly good writer who managed to put this into a dialogue so you could kind of see the contradictions in his own,
Hmm.
reasoning. And I, yeah, it's always like, what does a text directly tell you, and what does it show you? Subtly.
Yeah.
And so
Hmm.
much academic papers just to me seem like crash tests of isms. You install a Platonism and then you install a Cartesianism, and they crash with each other, and the result is actually quite foreseeable. That's what a good paper is, in my
Right.
opinion. Yeah.
A lot of the time, that is very, beautifully put. And there's just so much in that response that I want to kind of pick up on, actually, but without, yeah, kind of mining it, as academics sometimes say, or drilling down into it. These obviously extractivist metaphors that we use for kind of yielding up from the text what we can make use of. But yeah, the reading of the Phaedrus dialogue was fascinating. It's a dialogue that comes up a number of times. Like I've seen other theorists sort of bring the concept of a city of beloveds and an army of loves into a conversation about like democracy. Like how do you create a strong democracy, or a society that has trust built into it? There. I think Phaedrus says like there are no ties more profound than love, not blood, not nation, etc. But that aside, for the moment, but it's interesting to hear you describe sort of Plato leaving the safe haven of the city and kind of trying to go with the flow, as it were, because part of the point of your intervention is to, I think, unpack the power of passivity, of so-called passivity, and to show how what you call the dualism of passivity and activity misses an enormous amount about the role of passivity in thinking, like being seduced by your environment. Did you want to kind of expand on that in relation to the practice of writing, maybe, and also
Mhm.
just the contemporary attitudes folks seem to have toward boredom in particular?
So first off, I think I'm not entirely happy with the word passivity. I'm just using it in lack of a better word. So I bring in
Hmm.
the Chinese Taoist concept of Xi because I really feel like
Right.
this is something that Occidental thinking hasn't been able to grasp. And some today you have many authors which kind of embrace passivity, and let's say their critique of active, monorationalist, patriarchal reasoning is pretty much the same as mine, but then they fail to
Mm.
undo the dualism and they just solely embrace passivity. So they say,
Right.
yes, active reasoning is wrong. You cannot just like make the world an entire passive thing. It has agency in itself. So we also just become fully passive. But without
Mm.
doing the philosophical conceptual work of actually how do you undo the concept, you're basically still in a kind of zombie like way reproduce the same structure without realizing it. In most books, we basically just rather not talk about what is reason in a way, what is reasonability. And I felt
Hmm.
I get where it's coming from because it's such a toxic minefield. It's just easier to like leave it aside in a way. But then my teacher Didier Debes, he had this really nice phrase of they find their efficiency in their effacement. That just because you
That is
disavow
great.
something doesn't
Yep.
mean it's no longer there, but it might just exert a even darker influence from somewhere
Mm.
which you can hardly grasp anymore. And so I feel like,
Hmm.
to go back to passivity here, we really have to be careful to not just embrace passivity without undoing the larger conceptual dualist worldview, to use that word, or ontology.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I really like the concept of Xi, of Taoism, and I draw a lot, since I don't speak Mandarin or any other Chinese language, from this French semiologist François Julien. And for this, I think the concept of Xi is maybe the most developed we have for something we call intuition, the sensing of a potential. All of
Hmm.
what we kind of have as translations is very romantic, kind of as almost esoteric terms in a way. And I
Hmm.
think this is just due to the fact that our culture really for at least 400 years just builds on systematizing in a conceptual way the active part of reasoning in a way. And so we've always left aside this more passive parts of reasoning. So, and I feel there is this kind of trap set or opened up for romanticists, which then just, hop on the other side, but don't undo the entire concept. And just, I think Heidegger, his critique
Mm.
of modern functionalist reasoning is absolutely accurate, but he kind of just hops on this super romanticized blood and soil philosophy, which, he was a Nazi, so you can kind of tell where this led in a way. So it's really, I think, important to really think that you are a very limited being on this planet, and your conceptual thinking can only do very, very little steps in a way. And so I draw to the concept of Xi because the Chinese culture is probably the most developed civilizational culture on this planet. Like, it exists for much longer than European civilization as a kind of
Right.
civilizatory body in a way. And they really centered lot around their thinking around this Xi, about this kind of seeing a potential which unfolds in itself. So there's two movements. If you want to be an active agent in your environment, and every being wants to be that at some point, you kind of have to set a certain unity for yourself. I'm an I'm doing this in a universe I kind of have to set as passive to move through it in a way. And that's just one part of the deal. And the She is more about dissolving your own unity in order to see where do I actually, mingle with the others. I might just feel like this because there's this smell coming from here. I might feel like this because I have eaten something which wasn't so good and my tummy is a bit like this. I might feel like this because I did sport yesterday. And so my, all these factors which are like larger than you in a way, which influence you in a way. And the She is really kind of a, a method or a conceptual tool to think how this environment also creates certain results. What I found hugely inspirational is François Julien's juxtaposition of philosophies of war. in China and in Europe, in Prussia, Germany, where he's using this quote of Sun Tzu, the author of the Book of War, in which he said, the, the great general wins easy victories. That's the quote.
Mm, mm,
And to, let's say, a European mindset, that feels weird. We have a culture where we kind of glorify the 300 Spartans winning against, a million Persians and so on. So
right.
it's more like, here we have this kind of heroic kind of thing. I go with a gun and I shoot
Herculean.
everybody.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so we don't really get why is that a good general if he just like wins like this.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Julien explains this with the she, that a good general is kind of stupid if he just leads his 300 men against the million Persians. It's just dumb. You just think about what's the environment, how can I use the landscape that I'm kind of uphill in the battle, the nutrition,
Hmm.
the morale, which is another one of these like super fuzzy concept. Like, how can I create situations that the morale of the other troop is really bad and the morale of my troop is really good in a way. So all this kind of,
Hmm.
yeah, more circumstantial factors. Like, how do you ca- put them into your calculation in a certain way? And I think,
Hmm.
I mean, this is a very militaristic example. Sometimes I find this like, yeah, quite limited logics of militaristic examples work quite well to like make it plausible of what is efficiency from this she perspective. I wanted maybe to speak more about the writing you addressed. I think, and this is very personal, I really have the feeling also when I talk to other colleagues, we still have this mindset of writing being something active. I
Hmm.
always speak to
Even
colleagues.
agonistic, a
Yes,
struggle.
agonistic. Yes.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. So many of my colleagues, they go to the library at 10 in the morning and they sit there until 6 in the evening. Are super frustrated because they just wrote one page maximum and they just force themselves to sit in this like super crampy position in front of the computer. Nothing worked in a
Hmm.
way. And I systematized for my own writing. I usually prefer to write in the forest. I have a very good battery of my laptop, which was one of my major
Hmm.
investments. And so I really just
Hmm.
try to write whenever it kind of flows, when it comes in a way. And when I see, oh, I'm stuck in a certain way, I just stop. And I really know when you don't think about stuff, you actually do on a deeper level in a way. And it kind of comes back to you. And
Yeah.
I think also, like when you speak to mathematicians, I think they maybe see this the most lucidly in a certain way. Like, you want to solve this highly complex mathematical problem, and you would assume that's only something you can do in active conscious reasoning in a way because it's just
Mm.
logics. But even there, they just know at a certain point, you can sit in front of it and you won't solve it. And then, you just at some point are super frustrated and say, fuck it, I'll walk through the forest and so on. And you don't think about it at all. And at some point it just comes back to you and there's suddenly it's
Mhm.
the solution. And you don't even know how it came to you in a certain way. To systematize this thinking is maybe
Mm.
this kind of reasoning with the she, which
Mm.
how I try to explain myself this kind of Taoist concept from my admittedly rather meager understanding of Chinese thinking. Mm.
Mm. Wow. I mean, one direction that we could definitely go from that is to sort of engage with the ways that this AI hype cycle is trying to sort of capitalize on the notion that machine learning is akin to this like mysterious process of human inspiration, of unlocking these sort of ideas. That to me is a really interesting kind of horizon that your book is looking at. But I guess I wanted to stay because the book is coming at a time of accelerating ecological catastrophe with like the actual, the ways that pluralizing reason can be a more productive way, as you say, for dealing with the problems of the Anthropocene. I don't necessarily want to feed into the AI hype cycle either, but I think your book is useful for all of the insights that you have on it. So I definitely want to leave some time for that. Um, you know, the Anthropocene is one concept, the notion of reason, but there's also resilience. This engagement with the notion of resilience in your book, which itself has turned into a term that has purchase in a lot of places, from like advertising and agriculture to climate adaptation and like stock market trading. Your use, though, centers on the resilience of reason itself. And it's interesting that your answer to the resilience of reason, this force that you're saying totalizes and brutalizes the world, isn't to incite us to just do away with it. You say it would rid ourselves of too much, perhaps. If the concept's corrupted, the easy thing would be to flip it, like you were saying, to just kind of like fall prey to the trap of trying to invert it rather than subvert it, perhaps.
Hmm.
And I wondered if you had any thoughts on whether we can read resilience as fraught too, a term that maybe does more harm than good. What do you think? Like, how do you, because one of the things you say is that we need to be attuned to how abstract treatments and theory feels. So I guess in a way, my question is, how do you feel about the concept of resilience right now?
Mhm. Yeah, first, just a quick response to this question about reason and, like, flip it, fall into the trap. And I think it's more about delimiting its usage, because I think we've fallen prey to this megalomania that we found one form of reasoning which works admittedly super well in Newtonian physics, for example. And we thought, wow, let's
Mm-hmm.
explain the entire world like this, everything from our human psyche to the stars in another universe, another galaxy. They follow the same kind of reasoning principle. And that's just insane in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about undoing it, because I think then we basically still fall prey to the same megalomania. We just negate it in a way, but we just say, this works super well if we want to, do calculations about gravity or something, but it maybe doesn't work super well to understand the high complexity of the ecological catastrophe on a planetary scale we are witnessing at the moment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just to say this. Um, Coming to resilience, also there, I think it's not about criticizing it or only criticizing it. I think there's a lot of body of critique of the concept in, let's say, it's neoliberal deployment. So that it's
Mm-hmm.
usually just understood as a either individual or societal property, where basically capitalism is unchanged. So, the social welfare state is being dismantled. The psychological and medical health stress on individuals is higher and higher due to social media, due to digital infrastructures, due to rising fascism, due to climate catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are just urged by the system to become more resilient subjects. Our, I don't know, hospitals or social welfare systems should become more resilient, although we keep to austerity politics where they become frailer and frailer economically, because it kind of naturalizes the capitalist system and the stresses it produces, and basically just says, live with the stress of capitalism and just, get through it in a way. That's, let's say, the
Mm-hmm.
hegemonic deployment of resilience. And I feel there's a lot of critiques on this from the left, um, which I totally agree with. But I think it's a bit too simple to just stick with this critique, because it's always very easy to just stay in this position of the knower. Like, I'm the shaded knower. I
Mm-hmm.
understand how it really works and blah, blah, blah. And this
Mm-hmm.
in itself creates a lot of resentment against, which we maybe also see in, Trumpism, for example. Like, they hate us.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
I rather want to also, I think there's something very, very useful in resilience, as in any concept which is that big. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's just too easy to just say, no, it's bullshit. And so I more want to understand, why do we still have these problems of what I call mono-rationalism? Why do we keep looping back to the same model of reason, although we kind of should know better by now, that this kind of enlightenment, idea of bringing light to humans doesn't really work. I mean, we have half a century of post-colonial feminist critique of this, and you kind of feel like we should kind of understand it, but we kind of kick back to it. And so I
Yeah.
understand resilience in this sense. Like, what makes concepts so resilient that even although we have a huge understanding of what's fucked up about the thing, we still stick to the thing. And I think
Hmm.
this also can help explain a lot of contemporary political phenomena. Because I also feel that the right wing reaction at the moment is not caused by everybody loving the status quo or loving, whatever the current order is, but it's more like the discontent is led in a certain way that we just bounce back to even older layers of colonial sexist orders in a way. And so I think it's interesting to think about this kind of bouncing back effect which resilience allows. um, I think a
Hmm.
good example, for example, is that um, in the, let's say it's now 8 years ago, that the ecological topic around Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future really became mainstream to a level it hasn't been before. And
Hmm.
I of course loved this, but I was also always feeling a bit uneasy about this calls to reason and people should just listen to science and so on. And I know I had these discussions with activists who go to talk shows and then just scream at conservative politicians in the discussion table of like, just follow the science, just follow the science. And I was just like, wow, yeah, I get where you're coming from in a way, but this blind trust in science with a capital S has been hugely problematic before, and we have had 30 years
Hmm.
of science and technology studies critique on this, and I feel like now we're just bouncing back to just follow the science. And I think the most accelerated version of this kind of bouncing back we had during COVID, where it felt like the progressive answer is just follow the science. And we I
Hmm.
felt like, have we completely forgotten all the very, very valid critique of scientific fact making which we basically have been
Hmm.
devoted to 3 decades earlier. And now we kind of just came back to this really, I don't know, almost, how do I say this, yeah, very naive conceptualizations of enlightenment thinking. Also in the post
Myopic, I think weirdly myopic as well.
myopic,
Like,
yes. And
just in the sense that you're responding to crisis and you can't see past the crisis. Or the ways in which the ends are kind of intimated in the means,
mm,
and you're in the ways in which you might be reproducing faulty and difficult to exclusionary logics. And I mean, like the thing that you brought to mind, I mean, there are ways in which that sort of appeal to just follow the science isn't just exclusionary, but is, fatalistic in certain ways. Like the nature of climate science so far has been that it's doomed us to a certain gradualism where people are kind of shocked suddenly by the speed with which the collapse is happening. Right. So, I mean, these are things that get, I think, baked in as we, make these expedient gestures to just follow the science. And I think that's why, you're giving us all kinds of really interesting reasons for using narrative as a way to communicate the lived reality of the climate crisis. Like there's this idea that a planetary emergency matters more deeply when it's felt in our bodies, helps us out of that simplistic and actually pretty alienating place of just insisting upon the science. So, like you talk about how global warming or the sixth mass extinction aren't necessarily brought to life or driven home when we encounter their effects, even. So, I wondered if you could maybe explain to folks what you were getting at with that, maybe correct me if I misread
no,
the
no,
book in
they
any
totally
way.
got it. Yeah. um
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yes, if we say follow the science, it basically just means bombard the people with more numbers of how many particles per million of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere and
Hmm.
how fast the ocean levels are rising and so on. So it's basically just a bombardment of abstract numbers we are being fed through media. And
Mm-hmm.
our reaction to it is like, yeah, we can be shocked, but it's basically just in the mind. We understand it, but it's hard to kind of process such extremely abstract information about the composition of an atmosphere into something like a somatic uh,
Hmm.
um, response. And
Right.
so I really feel like to not again reproduce this body mind dualism that, we're all rationally conscious of how fucked up our situation is in terms of ecology, but still we are also bodies which have to go through an everyday life and go to work and so on. So I think it's again like, how do you make it plausible that catastrophe is happening actually around you all the time? And there again, I loop back to the car, because I really feel like it's the most
Mm.
easiest example to tell people, like, if you actually don't just focus on the appointment you have in 5 minutes and you have to catch the train or whatever, but you're on the street and you just stand there and it's dark right now because it's still winter, it's raining, the street is wet and it's so loud, you're blinded by the lights of the
Yeah.
cars. And just to like stand there and apprehend that this is actually really disconcerting in a way might be for example, a
Mm.
productive way of seeing how does the catastrophe feel on an everyday level.
Hmm.
um, and there we can align ourselves to sensory perceptions which are maybe closer to like animals, for example. There's very good studies that next to streets, wildlife is diminishing like crazy, because it's kind of,
Mm.
if there's other places you can still go to, that's more and more the problem, that there's less and less of these, you won't hang out next to a street. And so I
Hmm.
think more is like bringing home the sensuality of it is part of, yeah, part of the politics we have so far not focused enough on. Although I would be careful with who I talk about
Mm.
this we from, because there's of course many cool people
Of
who
course.
work with this. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
I love that, and Dominic Boyer's new book, No More Fossils. I've been reading that, and it is about sort of experiments with a different relationship to intermittency, sensuality, these rhythms of the earth as we attempt to break this cultural attachment and addiction to, especially oil. Um, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned Trump, and I feel like we have to talk about the big orange elephant in the room. The question right now is people are shocked by the speed with which he's just destroying all of these government agencies. And it's happening alongside a collapse that is happening at an accelerating rate, an ecological collapse. There are different political reactions and different reactionary politics emerging right now from the emergency. Trump, you say in the book, is your name for the worst version of that. I wondered if you wanted to comment just on the most recent news from The Guardian that the Trump administration has not only stripped mentions of climate change and global heating from government websites, but is now, quote, withdrawing grants and other support for research and even references to the climate crisis, so attacking the university. How do you read the policing of climate research at this moment of volatility? And I suppose, why did you sort of almost name the worst version of a climate dystopia simply Trump?
Mm. I mean, to me, drill, baby, drill is the most cynic kind of statement in this. And I've been
Right.
fascinated by the statement of JD Vance in Munich recently, where he
Mm.
was telling to the, collected European leaders, what was this quote again? If American democracy can survive 10
Oh,
years of Greta
yes.
Thunberg scolding,
Yeah.
you guys can survive a few months of Elon Musk. So he's directly comparing the most powerful and richest man of the world to what was a teenager back then.
Hmm.
But I think that, I mean,
It's
this
jaw
is really,
dropping. Yeah.
yeah, this is, I mean, that we should talk to many psychologists of what kind of resentment driven stuff is happening there. And
Hmm.
and I think there's two layers to it. I think the aversion to people, be it Greta Thunberg or somebody else, telling you, the lifestyle which has been cherished as the good life, promoted as the good life for the last century, is all of a sudden, the bad stuff, like something somebody scolds you for. That there is a certain reaction of aversion, of resentment, of like just not wanting to hear it. I think that's quite natural. It's also kind of a natural part of digesting an information in a kind of mourning process in a way. But how this, let's say, understandable affective dynamic is at the moment condensed into fascist politics, and I think it's we really have to name it as fascist politics. Uh, that's the scary part of it, because it's kind of capitalizing on effective dynamics which we all have, and I think it's also important as a kind of counter politics to first like acknowledge, yes, we all want to disavow climate change. Sometimes we all are climate change denialists. We all hope that it's getting better than what climate science is doing in a way, so that's a natural reaction. But how politics at the moment is capitalizing on it is scary. I think there's a really good book by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective on it, which I found the most helpful in understanding this really as a wave of fascism, really in the traditional sense, as much as historical fascism, so Nazism or Mussolini fascism, was the response of the capital holding class to an exterior threat. And I think that's the important thing. I mean, there's on the one hand, there's the despairing white middle class in the Americas, and their despair is effectively understandable in a way. But fascism only becomes dangerous if the elite class is deciding to rather support them, but to maintain the capitalist, liberal, democratic order we have been seeing so far, in a way. And I think this in the US is now becoming extremely clear, with the entire Silicon Valley elite immediately embracing Trumpism, that this is the dangerous shift. I mean, the crazy people driving around their trucks with Trump flags, that's one thing. But the people in power who are rather saying, yeah, let's rather support them. We can do more of the stuff we want than with the like, kind of loose liberal democracy we've had so far. Yeah, I think the danger is that at the moment, the capitalist elite perceives a danger by ecological activism as personified by Greta Thunberg, where they really feel their capital privilege, which is still mostly based on access to fossil fuels when boiled down, that this is so endangered, they now much rather support this kind of fascist plebs with their trucks, which kind of probably they also find a bit off-putting in a way, but it's still rather we ally with them than to risk having that kind of liberal free speech democracy we had so far. I think it's quite interesting because I didn't really perceive any danger to the capitalist elite in the so-called American liberal democracy. And I'm really worried about the progressive response to this, as we need to defend the institutions and need to defend democracy, because I really feel the frustration on the base of this fascist phenomenon, the truck drivers again, is just created by the system they are just dismantling. And also, so on an effective level, understand the reaction of wanting to defend it, but I think it really should rather be a cue for us to understand that this system is collapsing, and we kind of have to work on making it collapse into better structures, because that idea of liberal nation state with basically free trade capitalism and so-called liberal democracy didn't work in terms of the environment or in terms of many other topics. And yeah, so I think it's a really important task to really analytically differentiate between the effective dynamic, which I think is understandable and can teach us a lot, and still fighting, the fascist power grab we see so open to the eye that it also surprises me, like how fast this went, that now Silicon Valley just completely shows their real face in a way. And at the moment, I hope this can be helpful as a moment of truth. Like, I mean, now I feel all cards are on the table in a way.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's no longer pretend that this is the democracy we want to save, but rather like work on more democratic forms of self-governance.
Right. That could, maybe get us out of this mess, right? Through some kind of a collective intelligence, communal rejuvenation of, the caring, sharing muscles that I think are still there. Against that, though, like you point out, and it's interesting that we've gotten to the question of Silicon Valley. You point out that artificial intelligence is now used, you say, by both politicians and entrepreneurs and even academics as an empty code word for something. You put it in italics, something, right? That will enact the radical change that we need. You say we still seem to want to believe that an all-seeing, all-understanding mind is possible that would allow us to master the worldly trouble once and for all. But you see a fatal flaw in the contemporary models for generating artificial intelligence, um, largely around how they are replicating Cartesian, classic kind of notions of reason, etc. I really kind of wanted to hopefully leave some time at the end of the conversation here for you to expand on that, in relationship to not just the AI hype cycle, which is about the ballooning economy around AI, but the notion instead that an artificial general intelligence will save us,
Mm,
like that promise of a utopian AI.
yeah. I mean,
Mm,
there's this church, the way of the future, which is
mm,
basically a church which believes that so-called singularity of artificial intelligence is upon us very soon, and so they kind of
mhm,
already start venerating it. And I think just by political consequences, like this kind of later day doomsday Christian belief, which just doesn't believe in the Messiah coming down. They don't call it the Messiah, but artificial intelligence. That kind of the consequence is the
mhm,
same, is already quite telling what the actual ontological construction is. And
mhm,
I also see AI as a reaction to the climate catastrophe. And I really see this at the University of Applied Arts, where I work, that where Anthropocene was kind of that concept, the buzzword that everybody was working with 5 years ago. Now it's AI. And I've recently been in a discussion
mm,
with a colleague of saying, yeah, but we have to work with AI to take it away from the right wingers, and all the kind of demagogic deployments of AI. And I'm just like, if you refocus your discourse from Anthropocene on AI, you're part of the backlash in a way. You're kind of, even if you
mhm,
criticize them, you still talk about the role of technology and not about, the non human, other kind of planetary factors
mhm,
in a way.
mhm.
And I mean, the AI discourse is so vast that it's always a bit of a minefield to say something that somebody else cannot disprove. But I also feel there's
Mhm,
so
mhm.
much idiocy in professionalism that I kind of dare to venture out and still kind of take this broad analysis that the model that still most AI models that are out there is built on is basically a Cartesianist reduction. So there is
Mhm.
no somatic engagement with anything which could be a material world out there, but it's just a reduction to very simple logical principles, which are then
Right.
accelerated to the billions and billions of speed that we could do. And then we're surprised that nothing, surprising comes out in a certain way, other than they're just reproductions of very old, all too modern concepts in their kind of zombie metamorphoses in a way. And
Mm, mhm,
I worry about this. Like Alva Noé, who is a scholar who worked brilliantly on what he calls the computational image of the mind, he has this sentence I
mhm.
really find helpful, in saying the only way to artificial intelligence is to create artificial life. And I
Mm,
think that is a helpful sentence to kind of undo again this very old dualism of that intelligence is something completely detached from a bodily incorporated relationship to the environment, and just thinking intelligence is something hovering up there in a way, and we can reproduce it with huge server landscapes. And by this we're completely ignoring the fact this idea of intelligence we're now putting so much money in is just a very
so
reductionist idea of intelligence, which actually, brought us to where we are at the moment. And we're now seeing it as the kind of messianistic kind of solution. I really have the feeling that since our Occidental idea of intelligence is this detached logocentric concept is so deeply anchored in our understandings of the self, of politics, that now relying so much on artificial intelligence leads to a certain paralysis in politics, because we might not all adhere to the church of the ways of the future in which we really believe that AI is coming, but I think there's still a certain belief that intelligent agency is less and less beholden only by us humans, but also by artificial intelligence. And so I think this belief in intelligent agency is no longer what we can do, is an extremely dangerous element in contemporary reactionary politics.
Where we're absolving ourselves of accountability, it feels like.
Yes.
We're effacing ourselves in the interest of efficiency, but with catastrophic effects. I mean, you point out that the actual, energy and resource demands of AI are extraordinary. It's also the case that in many places, AI is being used to accelerate the identification of military targets or to open up new, sites for extraction. The actual uses of it, we seem to believe we don't have a say in determining. But you have to kind of for me, it's like not a question of whether the singularity will, as Sam Altman put it, power up things in all of these fantastic ways and invent some, solution that we can't imagine. It's and what I found really useful in your book is that you're saying, what if actually another AI is possible, one predicated on the creation of life? And if we engage with that potentiality and decide that's not a reality we want, or that's not a thing we can achieve, then it is within our capacity to pull back from that catastrophic future. At least that's, the potential I see is a potential for refusal on some level.
Yes, and also again, it's about delimitation. I would say, it's again not
Yeah.
about saying AI is all wrong. Like maybe you use it to, transcribe our conversation. I do it when I do radio shows, for example, or for translation. It's an amazing tool.
Right.
But to again see it as this kind of all-purpose tool to solve all our problems. I mean, what kind of defeatism is inherited to this kind of belief, which you now hear politicians of really all political colors say, that they really say like AI will bring the innovations to you pull in blank field and the innovation will come by AI. And that's actually just sad. Actually, it's really sad that you believe so little in human agency. And I understand where the cynicism comes from in the dark time we inhabit in, but yeah, I think my book is a lot about building hope in these catastrophic times, to still believe in the possibility to think otherwise, and to think or to understand this thinking otherwise as something which always includes other beings. And if you include these other beings, other results will come out. If you just, make certain rare earth materials like silicium your slave to enact your thinking, that will be the result, and we see the environmental impact already. I mean, Microsoft bought 3 Mile Island to reactivate it and make a nuclear plant there again. I mean, that's just so insane to me in a way.
It's the AI gold rush, I think, is the situation. Market speculation is just that. It's about sort of, Cory Doctorow talks about like punching zeros into a spreadsheet, right? Like, yes, you're investing, but at the same time, the market is ballooning just out of pure speculation on the ways in which AI might be like the new electricity, like a level of, market transformation that, it's going to turn into this winner take all kind of game, right? But we're all being played by it. And I think, what I love about your book is that it does allow us to kind of recalibrate our focus to the somatic and the non-human. But it also is just like a treasure trove of liberatory concepts, right? So if people are lacking hope. It gives a
Oh,
philosophical
thank you so much.
grounding for a certain hope. And yeah, I really appreciate you making the time. I'm glad we could find the time. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thank you for your very, very kind words about the book, and it was a lovely conversation. Thanks a lot.